Good evening. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has begun his two-day visit to France. He will be the chief guest at the Bastille Day celebrations tomorrow, which is a rare honor for a visiting foreign head of government. On the table are also multi-million-dollar defense deals, including 26 Rafales, the Navy version for the Indian Navy, 3 Scorpene submarines also for the Indian Navy. There's also going to be cooperation on engine development for the advanced medium combat aircraft. And of course, when it is India-France, how can we not talk about nuclear cooperation? So a whole gamut of deals expected to be signed tomorrow when the formal end of his visit begins. But more than that, it is about India and France and their partnership in the context in which this visit is happening. It is happening at a time when Europe is going through a bit of an existential crisis because of the Russia-Ukraine war. France's position, for example, in this war is different from Britain's position, which is different from Germany's position. What can India offer as it wades past these choppy waters of uncertainty? It's been well over a year now since this war began. What is it that India can offer to Europe and to France at this time of uncertainty?
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just touched down on his visit to France. Behind me, in a very special gesture, the Prime Minister of France, Madam Elisabeth Borne, has come personally to the airport to receive the Prime Minister.
I'm so proud to be an Indian. It's been 40 years that I've been working for the culture and academics in France. Thank you, Modi ji. Thank you. Proud Bharat. Very proud to be Bharat.
I was very excited. बहुत अच्छा लगा मोदी जी को इतने पास से देखने का.
Even chatted with a couple of people. I was mesmerized, so all I could do is just say namaste. But he has an aura. He's wonderful to look at. He's wonderful.
I think it was a very memorable moment when he looked at us and he patiently met every one of us. And we are from GIO team, so we were so excited to meet him.
It was a really nice experience to meet him. I talked with him for 30 seconds.
All right, I want to first go across to my colleague Sanjay Suri, who's joining us live from outside the Le Saint Musical Centre, which is in Paris on the outskirts, where in a couple of hours from now there will be the Indian Diaspora event. Sanjay, first things first, before we get to the diaspora part, what is happening right now? I believe the Prime Minister has met with the head of the French Senate. He's meeting with some legislators in the National Assembly building. Just walk us through what's on schedule, what's on his schedule for the rest of the evening.
Well, the meetings with the head of the Senate and with the Prime Minister have just about concluded, and the Prime Minister will be heading now to this event at La Saint Musical. And of course, you see a stream of people pouring into this venue, and this has been on for a few hours now. People getting in nice and early, a measure of popularity and of determination to be there when Mr. Modi speaks. But of course, these are times when Europe is in choppy waters. With choppy waters, one has to say the Indian government has been negotiating rather skillfully. Remember the early UN resolutions on sanctions against Russia, which India abstained from, and that created some disquiet. But since then, India has been in touch with Putin. India has been in touch with Biden, with Macron, as we see now, with the leaders from Britain, from Germany, from everyone. So India is managing these choppy waters rather well for itself. Whether it can calm these waters is another question.
I just also want to... All right, we're getting live pictures. This is the Prime Minister meeting with the Prime Minister of France, Madam Elisabeth Borne. These were pictures from right outside the National Assembly complex, where, of course, he will be having that meeting with the French Prime Minister. He's met with the head of the French Senate. And then subsequent to the conclusion of this meeting, he will be heading to the Indian Diaspora event. The Indian Diaspora there that he will be addressing, who are fewer in number compared to, let's say, the number of Indian origin folks in the UK or in US or Canada. But the Prime Minister has a packed schedule for today and for tomorrow. As we get these live pictures, this is our Prime Minister meeting with the Prime Minister of France, Elisabeth Borne. Let me go back to Sanjay Suri, who will walk us through these pictures as well as bring us up to speed with what is expected tomorrow. Of course, Prime Minister is the chief guest for the Bastille Day celebrations. How and why is that such a big deal? And also, talking about big deals, what is expected to be announced and signed tomorrow when the bilaterals happen?
Well, tomorrow we can be looking at two big deals, the ceremonial big deal and the substantive big deal. And the ceremonial big deal, of course, is the Bastille Day parade, and it's quite an honor for India to be invited, and not just invited by way of an invitation to the Prime Minister as chief guest. The military contingent will be there, Indian Air Force jets, Rafales, needless to say, will be flying. So it's a diplomatic expression of honor and importance, and that is sort of necessary sometimes in this world of diplomacy. Even though this will appear on the face of it only ceremonial, it indicates a measure of very great importance that France is according to India, which of course leads to the substantive issue, and that certainly will not be only a ceremonial. We do get carried away by Indo-French relations, which have been very good. France has supported India militarily through the Kargil war, particularly the Mirage 2000, the systems on board that were very effective in surveillance. With the Rafale deal, the 36 Rafales that came, the Indian Air Force wanted a lot of changes, and the French carried them out very fast and very efficiently at a cost, of course, and that is the question. We are getting what we want from France. There are no political impediments in the way, but the French are hard bargainers. India will get what it wants, but at a price.
All right. Sanjay Suri, for the moment, thanks very much. You keep an eye out for the rest of the developments later this evening. The Prime Minister is meeting with the French Prime Minister right now, and after that he will head to the Indian Diaspora event. There is a private dinner that's being hosted at the Presidential Palace by President Macron and his wife, Brigitte, for Prime Minister Modi. Let me also, as we mentioned, as you heard from Sanjay Suri a moment ago, the Indian military contingents will be part of the Bastille Day military parade tomorrow. It's going to be a tri-services contingent, Army, Navy and Air Force. And the person leading the naval contingent is Captain Raghu. Nair is the commanding officer of INS Chennai, the indigenously designed and developed missile destroyer, which is in Brest in France to take part in these celebrations. Thanks very much, Captain Nair, for speaking with us. As the commanding officer of INS Chennai, you're there in France. You'll be leading the naval contingent for the Bastille Day celebrations. What does this moment mean for you and the men you lead?
Well, firstly, for the service, I think it is a great opportunity, and that is why the Navy has decided to send one of its frontline ships all the way here to France. Personally, for my ship as well as me, it is one of the greatest privileges that have been accorded to us, and we are truly humbled by this honor.
Captain Nair, can you give us a sense of what is the current level of cooperation that we are seeing between the Indian Navy and the French Navy, both in terms of exercises and other cooperation that you have with your French counterparts?
We've been exercising with the French Navy for many years now, for decades now. And in fact, we just finished the last Varuna series of exercises, which is the joint exercise between France and India earlier this year. And incidentally, it was Chennai which participated in that exercise as well. And I had a brief exercise with the French Navy as I was entering Brest. And the level of trust and interoperability that exists today between the two navies is really at a different level. And that helps us enhance our engagements as well.
Contingent tomorrow. All right, let's open this up to our panelists. It's going to be a big visit, this Prime Minister visiting France for a two-day visit. He'll be the chief guest for the Bastille Day celebrations. Janet Jalil is a senior journalist joining us from Paris. Professor Scott Lucas is an international affairs expert. Vivek Kaju is former secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Dr. Tara Karta, former director with the National Security Council Secretariat. And Suhasini Haidar is diplomatic editor of The Hindu. Vivek Kaju, let me start with you first. Obviously there's a lot of focus on the defense cooperation, on, these deals that are likely to be announced tomorrow, the Rafales, the Scorpions. Has defense and particularly defense deals sort of become the cornerstone, the bedrock of this relationship between Paris and Delhi?
No, I think it's far more. France has shown an understanding of India's security needs. If you go back to 1998, the time when we conducted our nuclear tests, of all countries, I think in the Western world, it was France which showed the greatest understanding to us. So, for 25 years, France has done that, and there is a recognition in India that the French are very zealous of their strategic autonomy, even though they are members of the Western Alliance, the Transatlantic Alliance. And so they have an appreciation of the needs of countries like us. In the last 25 years, our relationship has grown many-fold in many directions. And of course, defense and security are a very important element in that partnership. Now, what interests me, Zaka, is not only the acquisition of modern aircraft and frontline naval vessels, but it is also to what extent are the French prepared to transfer technology to us, and what is our ability to absorb that technology and build on that technology. Because at the end of the day, we are, whether we like it or not, in a strategic competition with China.
Correct.
And the Chinese have become, in many ways, a scientific and technological power in this digital age, and that is the challenge we face. So while our defense needs need to be fulfilled, and the Americans and the French are partners, we can't rely on the Russians completely. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister is right when he says that there has to be Atmanirbharta. We've got to rely on ourselves, but we can only rely on ourselves when we become genuine producers of technology and modern technology and develop on what we get from it.
Okay, so let me ask Dr. Tarakarta. I think Ambassador Kaju made a very valid point. You know, obviously for a long time, for a number of decades, Russia was India's principal defense partner. Because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the problems that it has shown up, it's clear now that India can't depend on Russia for too long or to too much degree. Obviously, India is diversifying its defense partnerships. We have a very extensive, comprehensive partnership with the United States, and now, of course, with France through the Rafales and the Scorpions and so on, and earlier the Mirages. But then, how do you guard against this becoming merely a buyer-seller relationship, merely a transactional relationship? It's all very well. I mean, every time there's a visit to one of these foreign countries, we talk about transfer of technology and, you know, joint development and so on and so forth. It never quite happens, does it?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point that you're making. In fact, if you also go with what Ambassador Kaju was saying, it's not just a question of buying. It's also a question of whether, even if the other partner offers transfer of technology, whether you're able to absorb it. You know, for example, we had that issue when the Rafale was to be produced in India, and I think HAL said that they refused to certify the engines which the aircraft which HAL was to produce. So, but you know what? In this instance, I really don't think that the defense deals are the biggest thing, because it is important. These are all continuation deals. In the sense, the Scorpion continues from an existing Mazagon Docks Limited, which is going on. For that reason, it's important, because that means those docks continue with their employment. They continue with the learning.
Sorry, what is the most important part of this visit for you then?
I say the most important part is what is going to come out in terms of your space, because we have a very, very long engagement with France in the space area.
Yep.
Second is, remember, the Indian economy is growing. France is growing. I think the French bank assessed it as 0.3% growth next year. They're going to look for deals in India which is going to help them in their growth facility. Third is the fact that Piyush Goyal had gone to Paris. If you remember, he went to Paris, I think, 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And he was talking of 2,000 aircraft deals for the next 10 years. That's what we're looking at. Commercial deals. These are all commercial deals. and where we also already have, we have tie-ups with Airbus already in India. We are looking at the production in India. We are also looking at the growth of the economy. The defense deals is a sub-part of that. It is, in my view, it is not the most important. It is the rest of it which comes on, which is more important.
Which is interesting you say that, because, and Suhasini Haidar, I guess, can attest to this, but whenever we talk about trade relationships, France is not really top of mind. I don't think it's one of the top 5 trading partners for India. It's certainly not in the $100 billion league that we have with the US or even China, for that matter. Has the France relationship merely pivoted to, I wouldn't say merely, but pivoted essentially to defense cooperation and to some extent maybe nuclear and wider energy cooperation, as opposed to a trade relationship? I mean, even with Germany, we have a far more robust trade relationship than we have with France.
Course,
you're on mute.
Many would say that it's because France is a part of the EU, and the EU FTA, the BTIA, is still being discussed. But you're quite right. Obviously, trade is not kept up with the rest of the relationship. But I think this visit, and I do agree with Ms. Karta over there, is about much more than the defense component of it, simply because what they're marking is the 25 years of strategic of the strategic partnership. It is coming at a very important geopolitical moment. There's the Russia-Ukraine war, where France has used its meaning of strategic autonomy to allow India the space to have its own relationships and policy there. It's also at a time where Europe, and France in particular, are trying to rework their relationship with China, talk about de-risking, where they can work with India together, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's also important and not completely negligible that Prime Minister Modi is going to Paris not 2 weeks after he was in the United States. And there is a sense of competition. France is not just trying to outdo what Washington was able to do during that visit, but also to make the point that, when you talk about co-production with jet engine technology, we're already on to co-development. We want engineers of both countries to work together. So what you're expecting to see in the next 24 hours is a cogent map, a roadmap of the next 25 years of the India-France relationship. Remember, France was India's first strategic partner. The second, I think you will see these defense agreements and other MOUs to be signed. I think the people-to-people component, not so much trade, but people-to-people component, will also be there, particularly as France opens up its higher education facilities, universities for non-French speaking students, gives scholarships to non-French citizens. So you will also see visas open up. I think on the nuclear aspect that you were referring to, there's perhaps not so much joy. They're still very much tied up on the issues of liability to begin with, India's liability laws, still a sticking point between India and France, India and the US as well. Although 8 years ago we did hear that the nuclear deal was done, it hasn't quite been done yet. And then, of course, space. Also a very interesting new area in the Indo-Pacific, sort of engagement between India and the non-Quad countries. So with the EU, with the UK, with France, with Germany, we're seeing a new kind of relationship emerge. France, of course, has an Indo-Pacific part of it, the Reunion Island and other parts. There. So the question of how India and French navies can do a kind of quid pro quo, work together when it comes to sharing their resources, sharing their facilities in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, let me also get Jana Jalil into this conversation. As Suhasini was saying, and I think Dr. Karta was also saying a moment ago, that this is coming at a time when Europe is going through a big churn. I mean, it's almost an existential churn. Because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Clearly, France has taken a slightly nuanced, slightly different position from, let's say, what the UK has done. India clearly has not has doubled down on its cooperation with Russia, particularly in the field of energy. How do you see this whole Russia-Ukraine war? It's certainly going to be in the backdrop. A lot of the conversation is going to be around it, particularly in light of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which isn't really delivering the expected results, and this rather tense NATO summit that we saw
I think that is a big...
ago. How do you see that playing in through the course of the next 2 days during this visit?
Yes, that's very much a part of this visit. France is concerned about the disruption to supply chains, to exports of, to imports rather, of raw materials and technology that this war could cause. It's also concerned about China's increasing military might and its assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, where France has a big presence. So I think, like the Biden administration, what President Macron is trying to do is to woo India as a counterweight to China in these very uncertain times where things are changing. I think one thing that France is really hoping to capitalize on is the fact that France could benefit from this war in Ukraine because Russia is unable to fulfill all of its military commitments. The war, in some ways, has exposed the shortcomings of its military equipment. So now France is hoping to overtake Russia as an arms supplier to India, and that's why we're seeing all these deals being mooted. But there are other things too. There is a warm relationship between the two men. They do have a similar vision because Mr. Macron has recently talked about how France and Europe should not just slavishly follow the United States in its confrontation with China, that it should create a third pole. And this sits in a similar way to the non-aligned position that India has had since independence, where India has tried to be neutral when it comes to matters concerning first the Cold War powers and now with the West and the war in Ukraine and Russia. But there are also other things too. For instance, there's this huge middle class that India possesses. France wants to increase trade with that. There's also the fact that many companies are now trying to increase production in India because of concerns about China. So France will no doubt be wanting to do that. I think a big focus for Mr. Macron is trade, but also geopolitics. And the fact that he has a warm relationship with Mr. Modi can only help.
The other big conversation point is certainly going to be China. Let me ask Scott Lucas this, because clearly I think it was when Macron went to China earlier this year, and then you had the German Chancellor go there as well. So this whole idea of de-risking came from Europe. And then, of course, now you have a series of American officials also who've been to China in the last few weeks. And again, this seems to be the buzzword about de-risking and diversifying from China, not necessarily decoupling. How may that fit in, though? Because India has its own set of problems with China and has been for the last couple of years now, since 2020, actually, when China tried to change unilaterally the status quo of the borders between India and China.
It's a great question. Let me take it in two stages. I think the first is with China itself. You're quite right to note not only the European leaders who have visited China, but the U.S. leaders, Secretary of State Blinken, Treasury Secretary Yellen, soon climate change envoy Kerry. And there's sort of a realignment taking place in the U.S.-European position, which is, I think, that we don't want confrontation with China, and we want to try to come to a type of coexistence. That, I think, in large part, has been because of the catalyst of Ukraine, with China detaching itself from support of Moscow and taking more of a middle position between Ukraine and Russia. But then that brings us to the second part of that, which is how does India respond to this as they look both at Russia, they look at China, and then they look at, say, Europe. And I think what you have is the answer that India tries to diversify and deepen its relationships. Diversify, for example, in the military sector, because as you noted, Russia is no longer a reliable partner. It hasn't been reliable for some time in terms of the resilience of what it provides India. But of course, with the problems it has in Ukraine, and with the likely defeat on the battlefield, because I do think the counteroffensive will succeed, Russia's not going to be in a position to be a primary partner for India, I think, in the near future. So what do? You build up relations with other countries, including the US and France, and you do that economically as well. So if you're going to coexist with China, but you still think it'll be a rival or even a threat, you build up those economic and technology partnerships. And here what's important, I think, with France specifically is India's talks with the EU, because it's not just bilateral relations you're talking about, but France gives you a door into the EU as those negotiations proceed, as well as giving you certain specific advantages in terms of French industry and technology.
You talked about the door to Europe. So let me ask Ambassador Kajju this. Even as the Prime Minister is visiting France, there is this debate that's been started in the European Parliament. The members of the European Parliament are debating the situation in Manipur. The Foreign Secretary had a briefing just before the Prime Minister left, and he said this is none of their business effectively, and that this is India's internal matter. How much of a sticking point will this be?
Obviously, it's something that we'll be unhappy about because it is an internal matter. And there is a sensitivity in India about foreign powers discussing India's internal matters. And this is something that Europe must be conscious about, whatever may be Europe's position on human rights, etc. And there is, I regret to say, an enormous amount of hypocrisy in the Western world on questions of human rights. But that apart, Zaka, if you permit me to say, as an analyst now, the real question that I ask myself is the extent to which Europe can exercise autonomy, autonomy on a genuine basis. To what extent is it still catching the coattails of the United States? There is a transatlantic partnership, and the dominant partner is the United States. The Europeans believe that they want their own space under the sun, but do they really have it? Yes, in these matters, things what Mr. Modi will discuss with President Macron, there is a French component, a bilateral component, and we will see it come to fruition, hopefully, because there is a compatibility of interests there. But when it comes to larger geostrategic issues, when it comes to questions of world order, is Europe really autonomous? Or when it comes to China, it is a junior partner and a very junior partner of the United States. That is a fundamental question that would confront Indian strategic thinkers and the government. And to that, as of now, there is no answer, despite all the comments that Mr. President Macron may make or the strategic elites in Europe may make. But are they in a position to chart an independent course on international issues, such as dealing with China? China poses a great challenge. Why? Because China, unlike the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where there was some kind of an understanding reached between the two camps, China, as of now, has shown no willingness to accept the parameters within which this rivalry, which is coming up, which is there before us, will operate. That, to my mind, is the real geopolitical issue in the world today. And on that, what is Europe's thinking? Is it separate from the United States? I think these are deeper questions that Indian government led by
Dr. Tarakarta, isn't that
person when it comes to
isn't that a dilemma for India? Isn't that a dilemma for India? Because I think it's very clear that the Europeans want to do trade and commerce with China. It's very clear even the Americans and the slew of visits that you saw from Janet Yellen to Tony Blinken, and now, of course, John Kerry is going to be there. I think they are clearly compartmentalizing, the West, both Europe and the US, are compartmentalizing their relationship with China, where they're saying, okay, while we have military and strategic competition and so on and so forth, but on the economic front, we're willing to cooperate. How does India then recalibrate? Because, we don't have the luxury of distance. I mean, we have an altered reality in terms of, the situation on the border, what China attempted to do 3 years ago, and that's not been resolved fully. How does India respond to this change that has been adopted, if you will, by the West towards China? Because it affects us as well.
Well, in all fairness, President Macron has gone the furthest in charting an independent course. I mean, rather than anybody else. I mean, he had the courage to go up in Beijing and say that we shouldn't follow the coattails of the US. That is one. Second is, in the recent NATO summit, I did not see, I mean, this is limited knowledge, I did not see a reference to the opening of a NATO office in Tokyo, which France had opposed. So they are, what shall we say, it's not exactly great news for us because China has an 80 billion, I think China-France 80 billion trade between them, which means there's a very strong business interest. But at least it is not a straight following of the NATO line in that part of the world, in getting the whole, the China, Tokyo, all that thing together. So that means there is some amount of independence by France in the larger US-China rivalry. So that is a good thing. Plus, the fact that I think 93% of France's exclusive economic zone is in the Indian Ocean. That gives them a solid reason to be there with us, which has nothing to do with us. That's an independent, there's nothing like common interest to make a policy. And I think that's where we score.
So Asni, one of the things that a lot of people have been talking about this, France had expressed an interest to be part of some BRICS plus sort of an arrangement. Today, the interview that the Prime Minister gave before he left for France talks about India emerging as a voice of the global South. Perhaps because of the Ukraine war, and maybe it's been accentuated because of the Ukraine war, do you think this is something that will be a part of the conversation? People are talking about a Quad Plus as well.
Certainly what President Macron said was if he was invited to the BRICS summit, he would definitely attend it in South Africa. I think he was speaking rhetorically, perhaps, but trying to make the point, as France has consistently made, that they shouldn't be clubbed with the rest, that they're not looking at zero-sum games and black and white sort of allegiances. And that Mr. Macron, if you remember, was willing to spend hours on the telephone with Russian President Putin even after the war was declared in Ukraine. So I think this is a part of that. Yes, can France be part of a larger grouping in the Indo-Pacific? Can India try and help France become a part of some of its global South groupings? I'm sure that is also the case. But I think, what really does come through is that if there is nothing else in common between a country like India and a country like France, different continents, different hemispheres, different, if you like, languages and all the rest, what does seem to come through, and this has been the theme through the 25 years of the strategic partnership, is both of their belief in sort of protecting their strategic autonomy. Now, you might laugh about that and say, well, they don't actually have that much autonomy in practice, but it's there in theory. From the days of de Gaulle in France, we've heard about strategic autonomy when President Macron, at a time like this, a geopolitical time like this, flies back from China and says something like, we cannot be a vassal state, referring to Europe and the US. Those are calls that actually surprisingly also ring in India, where India has for the last year tried to say, well, we cannot have exactly the same position on the Ukraine war they did. So I think that's where it comes from much more, Zaka. But you're absolutely right that there are places where the two countries could work together. But I think they work the best, if you like, on a bilateral scale. And as Dr. Karta and others were saying, there are parts of this relationship date back decades and decades. I don't think many people realize that, whether it's space. I think 1950 was the first collaboration, nuclear as well, for Tarapur, if you remember, and France's decision not to join the Western sanctions against India in 1998. So in each of these spheres has seen cooperation over the years. Obviously, they both look past each other when it comes to other deals that they are involved in. And on the subject of China and de-risking, even India is trying to de-risk, but both France and India have considerable trade ties with China at present. And I think both sides recognize that it's a complex relationship which you cannot just work into these binaries.
Janet Jalil, unlike India's relationship, let's say, with some of the Anglophile countries, UK, US, Canada, Australia, there is a strong people-to-people connect. There is a strong diaspora. I was just hearing a moment ago in another show that there are, 10,000 Indian students in France, and in comparison, there are 250,000 Indian students in the United States. How and why, or how would this go to the next level? Because you need that people-to-people sort of binding, if you will, for the relationship to go to the next level.
Yes, there is a big Indian diaspora in the US and in the UK. So that is a very strong connection between India and those two nations. But with France, it doesn't have that history, that baggage, if you like, from colonial times that the UK does. So when Mr. Modi comes to France, he's pretty certain that he's not going to get a lecture on human rights or criticism from President Macron over things like the Gujarat riots, which is still an issue in Western countries. And when Mr. Modi was chief minister back in 2002, Mr. Macron is focused purely on trying to have a strategic and economic relationship with Mr. Modi. Now, that has angered some left-wing parties in France, but we're talking about a time of economic crisis, partly caused by the war in Ukraine. So France will be trying to reach out to India, perhaps with renewed energy. And that's why India's been accorded this very rare honour. It's not often a world leader gets asked to be guest of honour at the Bastille Day parade. And so this is a sign of how important India has become globally. It's the fifth largest economy. It's the world's most populous country. There's just huge potential there for all these countries around the world that are now reassessing their relationship with China and with Russia. They're looking for new partners. And we've seen that now with the rehabilitation of the Saudi de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman. And we're seeing that India, as the world's largest democracy, is a more important player as far as the West is concerned.
Okay, I think Suhasini is putting her hand up for a quick point, and then a final word to Professor Lucas.
Very quick point. I think we also have to remember that this is not happening just today. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh actually was the first Indian Prime Minister to be the chief guest at the Bastille Day parade way back in 2009. And 5 French presidents have actually come to India as a Republic Day chief guest on 26 January. In fact, Jacques Chirac came twice, I think in 76 and then in 1998 when the strategic partnership was signed.
All right. Professor Lucas, final word. Even when he went to the U.S. and people are calling it a historic visit and deals were signed and the address to the Congress, the state ceremonies and so on, the question about the democratic backslide in India and human rights record, that did, occupy a lot of newsprint, a lot of television debates. Do you see any such moments with the French, or as one of the previous speakers said, there's not going to be any lectures on human rights?
No, I don't see it because I think, remember, if you and I had this discussion even a year ago, we would have been talking about tensions between not just India and the U.S., but tensions between India and Europe. Those were in particular because of the question of India's position regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But since then, what we've seen is this, not just a welcoming of strategic autonomy within India, it's a live and let live attitude, not just by the French, but by the French as part of a wider grouping. And that is that India is seen as valued in terms of that if it does not give diplomatic support to Moscow, that if it does not in any way support the invasion, it can shake the cheap energy and that will be fine because Prime Minister Modi might become an off-ramp or a way to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp in the future. Not now. There's no chance Putin will negotiate now, but later on, maybe you get him to accept his defeat. Now, in that context, that very much context of power politics, human rights, which is not just an Indian question, but is an international question, it takes a backseat. Okay. So just as in the United States, you might have seen a few people who have raised concerns about it in Congress. You would have seen activists raise concerns about it. You'll see that in France. The leaderships of the U.S. and France, and indeed of Europe as a whole, India's human rights issue, that's not something they want to be taking on at this point. Okay. The priority right now is immediately making sure that there is not any support from Moscow in its invasion, and more broadly, how do you realign the world? How do you realign the world economically, politically, and militarily in the wake of the shock caused by Vladimir Putin?
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to all our guests. It was a wonderful conversation, this. We look forward to what is scheduled for later tonight in Paris. And, of course, tomorrow morning is going to be the Bastille Day celebrations. I believe it will begin at about noon India time, when we'll go on for a couple of hours and we'll have it covered here on CNN News 18. But